of Integrative Health, MUIH. And today I'm honored to host a panel discussion on the intersection of herbal medicine and nutrition with three of our distinguished faculty members. Joining the conversations today, we have Professor and Program Director of Clinical Herbal Medicine Programs, Bevan Clare, Professor and Faculty Fellow in Course Development, Dr. Camille Freeman, and Department Chair of Nutrition and Herbal Medicine, Dr. James Snow. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who are following in from home, if you would like to share this, we'll be talking for almost an hour today about these fascinating topics. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat box. We will definitely answer them in real time. If you have anyone who you think would be interested in this topic, please share this on your social media or send it directly to them. And so with that, again, I'd like to welcome all of the panelists. Thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedules, for being here with us today, and for shedding light on these topics that we get a lot of questions about. I know I get a lot of questions about them, so I'm sure that you all do, and I know the university does. First of all, to kind of set the stage for our conversation, I'd like to speak with James. In your experience, and I know it's very vast and varied, I wondered if you could explain to us what the similarities and differences between nutritionist and an herbalist are.
Yeah, thank you, Amy, and thank you for hosting. So I'd say on the simplest level, that a nutritionist tends to make personalized and individualized recommendations around diet and food, and may also make some more generic educational recommendations around herbs. Whereas a herbalist would make those personalized and individualized recommendations around herbs, maybe formulating specifically for an individual, blending herbs, and would give more generic general education around nutrition. So there's a Venn diagram here, there's an overlap. Mm-hmm. Personalized and individualized care tends to either focus on food and diet or on herbal medicine.
I see.
I would say just a little bit more around that. I think that sort of one of the interesting considerations here is putting meat aside and animal products aside for a minute, is the spectrum of plants and where they fall under nutrition and herbal medicine.
Yes.
So I think we have this spectrum that crosses over. So there's things that clearly fall in the food category, and I put like grains and beans and things like that in there. So, you know, your rices and things like that are going to be mostly thought of as providing primary nutrients like your fats, carbs, proteins, minerals, vitamins. But then there's also these secondary plant metabolites, which are these sort of interesting compounds that plants make that are really sort of defense mechanisms for plants, or they may be regulatory compounds for plants. And people are familiar with these. They're often called phytochemicals or phytonutrients. So we have sort of isoflavones that people might have heard of in soybeans, and carotenoids, things like lycopene in tomatoes, and the glucosinolates and other things that you might find in broccoli. And so we hear about all these interesting compounds that are in vegetables and fruits often. Yeah. And that's sort of moving along the line towards herbal medicine. And so one of the key differences here is that a lot of those primary nutrients and primary plant metabolites you're going to think about in foods, but these weird secondary metabolites that modify the activity within the plants themselves also have some of those key health benefits for humans. And that's really where the herbal medicine comes in. Herbal medicine is really a source of those secondary plant metabolites that help tweak physiology, modify physiology. They may also have defensive properties for humans in the same way they do for plants. We've got some coevolution here. So both of us, plants and humans, have issues with infection. So we might take something like Oregon grapefruit or golden seal that has antibacterial compounds in it. Those are protecting the plant, but if we take those in, they protect us as well. That's very different than a food. No one's going to be eating Oregon grapefruit as food. It doesn't give you any vitamins, minerals, protein, fats, et cetera, et cetera. And so then you have this middle ground with things like nettles, which can be used as a medicine, but also eaten as a food. Wild foods like purslane or other things that sort of cross over. So there's a sort of gray area, and culinary herbs is another key one there, where we have these things that are used that are added to foods, but are also used as medicines, things like ginger or cayenne, even things like thyme, which in higher doses, obviously we know that as a culinary herb, but in higher doses are used as medicines. So there's this wonderful spectrum of plants, from purely providing primary nutrients to those that are purely adding these secondary plant metabolites that might have medicinal effects, to things that have a combination of both. And I think that's where we get this gray area between herbs and foods, and it's just a wonderful spectrum to play with. So I think that hopefully that gives some kind of basic answer there, some of the commonalities and differences.
It's a wonderful answer, and it's very succinct. And you didn't only bridge what all of you do, but you also brought me into the conversation with the culinary herbs. So thank you very much for that. And that's kind of the overlying theme and common denominator among this conversation, is that when different modalities work, it's hard to fit them into a modern academic curriculum field, because they do cross over, because they work, and we're much more complex as humans and as plants than just kind of what we can fit onto paper. So I love that. Thank you very much for explaining it that way. And I wondered, for Bevan and Camille, you both have experience in nutrition and herbal medicine. What would you add to that definition?
For me, the culinary herbs, the spices, the food pieces are really very central and important. And I think this actually comes more as an herbalist and less as a nutritionist, because I think that there's you know one of the tricky things about herbal medicine is that our modern lifestyles aren't always adapted to the way that it might have been done traditionally. So
Mhm.
people didn't grow up drinking um, decoctions of a lot of different roots and things, and they aren't used to those strong flavors, or the time it takes to make certain things. But I also think that the on the flip side, things like capsules and even herbal tinctures remove the sensory aspects of herbal medicine that are really important, that have been a very central part of what herbal medicine has always been. That if we suddenly are only popping pills, you don't get the taste and the smell, you don't get the understanding that this is a plant, and there's also a very different economic a picture when you're using prepared products. So for me, I really like, using herbs and spices. I like using fresh plants. I like, all of those aspects of herbal medicine. And I would say, especially in my personal life, I find that, for me, that's where wellness really is. It's not in necessarily buying a bunch of herb supplements.
Mhm.
It's about, herbal medicine being a food and integrated in with food, and so then all of a sudden the lines really blur between herbal medicine and nutrition. And when you look at something as simple as, like, an Indian curry with all of these different spices and a lot of spices, like, we're not talking about a little sprinkle.
Right.
Is this herbal medicine? Is this food? I mean, where are we with this? And so I love the intersection of these in what we do every day, and I think it ends up being particularly sustainable and enjoyable,
Mhm.
and even sometimes more medicinal to be preparing your product, your herbal medicines in those ways and consuming them as part of your diet.
Definitely. And it's also soothing, and you get the psychological aspect of the preparation and what goes into it, the different aromas as you're preparing it. So I think that's wonderful as well. And a lot of those, as you mentioned, heritage recipes really do speak to culinary medicine, because people didn't have other forms of medicine early on. So that's a great addition. What do you have to say, Camille?
Well, to add on to the lovely sentiments expressed by my colleagues here, I think I'd like to just throw in the piece that anytime we're interacting with plants, whether it's like James was saying, the foods or the herbal medicines or things that are blurring the lines between the two,
Mhm.
I think it also symbolizes a relationship with the ecosystem, right? Because we're inviting plant compounds into our bodies and they do interact with our own physiology. And
Mhm.
so I think that these days many people are sort of separate from the environment, from the ecosystem, from nature writ large. And for some people, eating or using herbs is their primary interface with nature and the ecosystem. And I do like to think about some of the chemicals, the phytochemicals in our foods and our herbal medicines as is basically the way that nature is communicating with us, that it's a relationship, it's a conversation.
Hmm.
And so the way that our bodies listen to the signal is by ingesting them, and then they interact with us. And to just share a physiology analogy, which I hope makes sense to people, is that when we're talking about hormones, which are the body's signaling molecules, the body's way of communication, we think of like, oh, okay, it's really important whether you have X amount of estrogen or X amount of cortisol or whatever, but it
Sure.
doesn't matter how much you have if your body can't hear it. And the
Mhm.
receptors are what dictate whether we're hearing it, right? In our body, if you don't have estrogen receptors, you can't hear the estrogen. It doesn't matter how much you have. And
Oh.
I like to think about the act of eating or ingesting plants as a almost similar to being a receptor. Like we are choosing to interface with the plant and therefore interfacing with the environment and adjusting to that input. And so I think it is, to me, the act of eating or working with herbs is a conversation with nature. And that's one that a lot of people aren't having in other ways. So I think it's a really important aspect of what we're doing.
That's fascinating. I would love in a little bit for you to kind of continue along those lines because this idea of the receptors is something that gets left out of so many fascinating otherwise conversations. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Um, Bevan, you're the program director of clinical herbal medicine, and I wondered how that differed from other areas of study in just herbal medicine at MUIH.
This is always a tricky thing. It's again, it's a little bit like the food and herb conversation, right? Where we have this spectrum and this Venn diagram. And in fact, it really comes down to the challenge of even defining what is an herbalist.
Hmm.
An herbalist is somebody who works with medicinal plants or with plants, usually for health or disease, as it may be. And beyond that, we get into just endless options. So, you know, being an herbalist, and this is a lot about the clinical herbal medicine program, is that we are training people to be an herbalist. It is one of the oldest occupations that exists. People, as have always been herbalists as long as we've been using medicinal plants, which has been forever. And so here we are. We have this career of herbalists now. Um, a fundamental aspect of herbal medicine is that there's many different explanatory models of herbal medicine. There's, all of our traditional herbalism, which was also a clinical practice in many ways and in all cultures where people learned how to use herbal medicine. They had an assessment model. They recommended things. They understood how they worked. There was energetics involved. All of these pieces came together. What we do at MUIH is clinical herbal medicine, where I always like to say that we're standing rooted in tradition and exploring the contemporary clinical practice. So, a lot of our goals in clinical herbal medicine is to create herbalists that can come up with individualized health supportive recommendations,
Hmm.
and by drawing on a number of different elements, and that can be cultural elements, it can be elements of tradition, it can be um, evidence informed aspects of herbal medicine. And so, we're kind of weaving all of these things together to create an herbalist that can interface with primary care and can be literate in the typical medical environment that a lot of people experience nowadays.
Hmm.
So, you know, I always say that in an ideal world, there would be an herbalist in every family. Somebody would know, enough about herbal medicine to be able to do that. And then, when you expanded that into the larger family, there'd be somebody with a little bit more knowledge. And then when you look at your smaller community, there'd be somebody with a little bit more knowledge. And then you'd have, kind of your regional herbalist who are there when you've kind of worked through all of these other options, and you are ready to explore it on a more formal basis, more deeply. And I think that's where our MUIH herbalists fit in. So I wish that there was, more herbalists for all of us to lean on, and just kind of a culture of herbalism
Mhm.
that our clinical herbalists could be there for. So, on a practical basis, we have several programs at MUIH. We have a Master's of Science in Clinical Herbal Medicine, and
Mhm.
we have a Master's of Science in Herbal Product Design and Development. And the big difference between the two masters is the clinical one, you're working with individuals, you are coming up with individualized health recommendations, you're interfacing with other types of providers, particularly primary care providers, but other healthcare providers. And in the HPDM program, it's much more about the products, about regulatory aspects, about safety, and about creating products that are for kind of general health areas of support. So overall digestive support or nervous system support or something like that. Whereas in the clinical program, we're looking at things that are formulated for the individual, and have that clear goal. So I think there's different types of herbalists, and this herbalist wants to work with people, and wants to be there for them in that healthcare environment.
Sure. We're getting a comment saying that it's very interesting, and I second that. And I especially, I love this idea of working with other clinicians and kind of assembling a team for different clients and different individuals who are, looking to optimize their health. Previously, that had been so difficult that I think there's a stereotype that someone thinks I have to go either one way or another. If I'm having, surgery and I'm working with someone who's going to operate on me, then this other type of medicine doesn't work. And it's, the more and more I hear from people at MUIH and the more I learn about the different programs, the more that I learn that that's not true, and that that's actually the opposite, and that most clinicians that are coming out of MUIH are very well versed in how they need to be part of a contemporary medical team.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. We are, as a institution and as a program and as individuals, I know all three of us very much embrace finding what is best in different situations and using these things together and understanding how to do that. So I think that there's just tremendous possibility, and that assumption that it's either I have to choose one way or the other is something that's really out there that I love to change, because
Right.
people often realize that of course we need both, and they do work so well together.
That's great. And Camille, I wanted to talk to you a little about the primary course that you teach at MUIH. So it's actually physiology, which you touched a bit on before. But I wondered how you approach the topic to align with the integrative emphasis both of the nutrition and the herbal medicine programs at MUIH.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so physiology is the study of the human body. And a lot of people hear about anatomy and physiology. And for people who might not be as familiar, anatomy is essentially naming the bits and pieces. And then
Mhm.
physiology is how the bits and pieces work. And so while we would absolutely love, and by we, I mean me personally, we would love to have a whole year dedicated to the study of both anatomy and physiology. People have a need to go on and learn about the herbs or the nutrition and so forth. So we really try to focus on just physiology so that people have this understanding of how the body works. And of course, we do learn some anatomy along the way as part of that. And sometimes people are a little bit confused as to why we include physiology or pathophysiology in the curriculum.
Mhm.
And the reason is, in my opinion, in order to be a really excellent practitioner, you need to be able to think through what's happening in the body. And so I think most people here who do any kind of, have any interest in herbs or nutrition will know that there's some basic things. For example, if you have depression, you'll go to the health food store and they might tell you, oh, St. John's wort, or, you're whatever. There's these types of things. And that's what I kind of call health food store herbalism, where it's like, there's some basic things. And is there some truth to that? Absolutely. Is it appropriate for everybody? No, there's lots of things you need to know.
Okay.
And what helps you become a great clinician is when you can think through what is going on in this person's body. What does healthy look like? Where are we trying to go? And then what do we know about how herbs or diet or foods or whatever else are going to move us in that direction?
Mhm.
And the place where people get stuck, I think, if you don't have a lot of training is, okay, you know that St. John's wort is, quote, good for depression.
Mhm.
But then you try St. John's wort and it either doesn't help or it doesn't work for you because you're taking a medication that's contraindicated or whatever else. And then you're like, okay, well, herbs don't work.
Mhm.
And in fact, if you understand, wow, okay, there's some cases of depression where we need to be looking way outside of these paradigms. We need to be thinking about the HPA axis, the stress response. We need to be thinking about sleep and circadian rhythms. These are all having direct impacts on people's risk and experience of what shows up as depression.
Sure.
And so if you understand the body and you understand what are the inputs that come into thinking about whatever is manifesting for somebody, then you can think through, oh, okay, well, here's some of the things we know affect that. They kind of pull on that string on the spider web and perhaps adjust the whole thing. And
Mhm.
so if you want to be an excellent clinician who can help people with complicated things going on in their lives, you've got to understand how the body works so you can think through it when the quote, normal things don't work. So that's one piece of it. That's why we have physiology as part of the curriculum.
Mhm.
And then in terms of your question about what is integrative, what's different about the way we do it,
Sure.
one of the things that I focus on at the beginning of the class is that when we teach physiology, most of the time, whether in medical school or nursing school or massage school or herbal or nutrition school, usually it's a systems-based approach. So we talk about the digestive system, we talk about the immune system, we talk about the kidneys, all these types of things.
Mhm.
And the reason we do that is because it's easy for us to wrap our head around it. But in reality, it's a whole, they're all connected. You
Mhm.
can't have the kidneys without the digestive system. You can't have either of those without the immune system or the cardiovascular system. So they're artificial designations. I liken it a little bit to state lines,
Mhm.
right? So you can cross from Kentucky to Tennessee and you're just driving on the road, nothing looks different, but actually it's a new designation. And in
Sure.
some ways, the systems of the body are like that, where we're saying, oh, this is the immune system and this is the digestive system. But in reality, the lines are blurred. They're not really two distinct things. They're all part of one organism.
Mhm.
And in the same way that we kind of separate things into systems, I think we also say like, oh, health, it's about the body. But in fact, what we know from at least the last several decades of study is that health also depends on your community, your ecosystem, the environment where you live, the structural issues such as systemic racism and all these types of things. These are important influences in your health. So if we try to say, oh, we only care about this one individual, this body, without saying like, oh, the context matters, this person's family matters, this person's actual physical environment matters, this person's community and the context in which they live matters. Those are all things that are affecting that one body. We need to understand that in order to best make changes in the overall health of the individual and the bigger system. And I think
Sure.
that's really the philosophy that we're bringing into physiology, is that yes, we're going to carve things up a little bit and look at individual systems. We're also going to think about how do these systems interface, and also how does the whole organism interface with the environment and the ecosystem in a larger sense.
Sure. I think that the analogy of the state lines was absolutely wonderful to help bring it home for people about, how the body works and all of the different things that you're looking at. And it's so wonderful to hear. We have a comment about Ayurveda, and of course, as you all know, and as a lot of people who are students at MUIH are aware, Ayurveda it's a field of study that does encompasses a specific type of thinking around nutrition and also herbal medicine and different philosophies as well. And there is a wonderful Ayurveda program, which we've talked about before. So anybody interested in that topic, we'll put up the links. You can check out that field of study that we offer, and also previous discussions that we've had about it here on our podcast. If you don't mind, Camille, I would love to just continue the conversation a little bit, because you mentioned something before that really piqued my interest. And there are a lot of very big names in health and entertainment and media right now who are talking about different type of hormonal things, menopause, fertility, and they're all talking about it, the concept of, okay, you may be missing a couple of hormones, you might be lacking some estrogen, so here's a supplement, here's a cream, here are some herbs from an herbal store which might help to address that. But I don't ever hear the topic of receptors being discussed. So I'm wondering if you could spend a little bit more time explaining that to people.
Sure. So, just to reiterate, in case some folks are joining us partway through, we were talking earlier about how, hormones are one thing circulating in the blood. These are signaling molecules that travel through the blood and can help transfer signals from one part of the body to another. But in order for a hormone to work, it has to bind to a receptor. And individual cells essentially choose to express a receptor or not. And that's going to be based on a bunch of different factors related to that individual cell. So without the receptor being there, the hormone isn't heard. It doesn't have any effect in the body. And I think the reason we don't hear this being talked about a lot is because we can't measure them.
Mhm.
We can measure hormones in the blood and we can say, oh, your hormone level is X, Y, or Z, depending on which hormone you're looking at. But for the most part, we don't have a way to say, oh, you've got this number of receptors, or your receptors are high, your receptors are low. First of all, that's because they change millisecond by millisecond. The cell is genetically expressing the proteins and inserting them either in the cell membrane or, depending on within the cell, wherever it is.
Sure.
So that's changing. You can't measure it, and it's a cell by cell basis. So some tissues will express receptors, some will not. So we don't have a great way of saying, here, this person has 100% expression and this person has 50 or whatever it is. But to me, it comes back to cellular health. So does the cell have the inputs that it needs to make the receptor when it wants more and to not make the receptor when it doesn't want more? Does the cell have signals that are giving it the right information? This is one of the things when we hear about inflammation, that's kind of all over the news as well. We hear about inflammation. One of the things inflammation is doing is it's changing the ecosystem of the cells nearby and leading those cells to either express or not express different proteins and change the way they're working. And so that may be part of what's influencing these things. I think the danger, maybe not danger, but the problem I have with people who are like, oh, let's just look at this hormone and then see if we can replace it or see if we can give people an herb or a supplement or something to try to get the hormone back to normal, is that typically speaking, when we're measuring a hormone, it's just a snapshot in time, and hormones are changing. I mean, just in the time we've been here talking, all of us have had major hormonal shifts. Things are happening in our bodies. We're getting signals and things are adjusting and adapting. So if we take a hormone level at one moment, that doesn't really necessarily indicate how things are going overall or on a day or month or anything like that. So, trying to manipulate them can be a little bit challenging sometimes. And then we also run into the dangers of overriding what the body is trying to do. So if you say, like, the level is low, let's make it higher. Well, why is it low? Why is the body not making it higher by itself? Like, what is going on there? Because there may be a reason. And if we try to override it, either A, it may not work, or B, it might wind up being harmful in the long run.
Sure.
So for me, as a person who focuses on fertility, I would rather think, how can we support the body as a whole so that it can try to balance its own hormones versus trying to directly influence them by pulling some strings. There's absolutely time and a place where hormonal replacement may be needed, where I'm not anti oral contraceptives or anything like that, but I am saying that if we're trying to, quote, diagnose somebody with a low hormones or high hormones or something like that, then I want to think carefully about why that is, and are there things that we can do that essentially back it up a few steps? So can we make sure that the person has the building blocks they need from their diet? Do they have are they experiencing a lot of stress, and are they managing that well? Because that can lead to problems with fertility and a bunch of other areas of the body and so forth. So for me, that's this is a very complicated it's a complicated question, but hopefully that answers it a little bit. I don't know if James.
It's a great example. You gave great examples and really helped to make it clear. So I appreciate that so much. You also said something about the plants and the kind of the symbiosis between humans and this relationship that could be harmony because the cells were seeking something. Maybe they were in the plants. There was like a dialogue piece. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I think it just comes back to what James and Bevan were saying earlier about the phytochemicals in the plants, which we frankly don't really have a great idea of what. I mean, we have some indications of what's where and which plants have which phytochemicals, but a lot of it changes based on the growing environment, based on when they're harvested, based on how they're stored. There's a lot we still don't know about what is in plants and how the specific synergy works from one plant to one person.
Mhm.
But that is, in terms of when you eat something and it changes the way you feel, whether it's an herb or a food, that's what's happening is your body is communicating
Sure.
with the food and something is happening, something is changing. So I don't know if James or Bevan, if either of you all want to chime in on this one, I'd love to hear what you all have to say too.
Yeah, I think there's some fascinating aspects to this. And so one of the big aha moments for me in studying plants was the idea that was understanding that we co-evolve, like animals co-evolve with plants.
Mhm.
And a plant that's sitting there doesn't really want to be eaten by an animal.
Mhm.
Like, it's not in its best interest, the fruits aside, right, for spreading seeds. So it builds these defense mechanisms.
Mhm.
And so a lot of these secondary plant metabolites are defenses against mammals and insects and other things that are out there eating it. And so the question sort of becomes, well, if the plant's defending itself against us, why is it healthy for us to eat that?
Right.
And this has to do with our coevolution. So one of the big moments for me in understanding herbs
Mhm.
was the idea that the reason many plants are good for us is that they're a little bit bad for us.
Mhm.
And so this is like physical exercise. Like, why does exercise make us stronger? Why does lifting weights make us stronger? Well, it's because it slightly damages our tissue, and our tissue realizes it needs to bounce back against that. It needs to build resilience. It needs to get stronger to handle that stress. So a lot of what these secondary plant metabolites are doing is providing a little bit of cellular stress when you consume them.
Mhm.
And those mechanisms are all relatively clear for this, that this induces some cellular response pathways. We start making our own antioxidants in response to this. We start making growth factors, heat shock proteins, all of these cellular compounds that actually make the cell more resilient.
Mhm.
So a lot of what herbs are doing plants in general, our foods, particularly those with these secondary plant metabolites in them, is that exercising our biochemical pathways in the same way that physical exercise exercises our muscles and other things. And it makes us stronger, makes us biochemically stronger.
Right.
And so a big problem in this country is that the food industry systematically bred these compounds out of foods because they taste slightly bitter or pungent or acrid. And so we're left with sweet and salty and a little bit of sour, but we don't have bitter, we don't have acrid or pungent. And these are where a lot of these secondary plant metabolites have these flavors.
Right.
And so the idea about the intersection between humans and plants is we need to exercise ourselves by eating different colors, eating different flavors, eating different chemicals. That actually makes us biologically stronger.
Perfectly stated. I'm gonna record this snippet and just play it over and over again for people. That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you all for doing such a great job of giving examples for that. We're getting such wonderful feedback. This is a fantastic conversation. Thank you. I'm an MUIH grad 2. This is from Debbie Larimore, I believe, if I'm reading that correctly. We also have Ansa saying thank you for this MUIH graduate here, Dre Mack. And so we're getting a lot of people following in, and that's wonderful. If anybody has any questions, if you know anybody who might like this conversation, please go ahead and share it. We still have some more questions to go. So next, I'm going to start with Bevan. I just kind of wondered how you all got started, whether it's nutrition or herbal medicine. What made you really want to hone in on this particular field of study and make it your livelihood?
So I think that a lot of us are kind of called to this field. I mean, as I mentioned, it's one of the uh, oldest professions that exist, and I do think that there's just people who have always been very drawn to this, and because they make their way here. It's very unusual that you would go to, let's say, your high school guidance counselor and say, "I'm trying to just consider what career I should do," and they're like, "Ah, you should be an herbalist." I mean, that's very unlikely to happen. And at MUIH, we get a lot of people who already have had a career. They've already done one thing, and they're like, "But I was always tugged in this direction." They want to do something that aligns with their values. They want to do something that feels meaningful. So for me, I think the other characteristic of some of us was that we were like potion makers in the sandbox, or we were kids that were always like going through the woods or the forest or the local city park and finding acorns and rocks and just observing different things that are around us.
Mhm.
So for me, I was definitely one of those kids. I loved plants. I remember specific plants from my childhood, even though I didn't know what they were at the time, but I do now because I remember them well enough. And so I started getting interested in herbalism as a young teenager. I was really interested that, there were these plants, and that was just cemented by the idea that I started to think about, especially as a teen, being aware of these different plants that people were taking into their bodies, and they would do things. Being aware of things like cannabis is like, wait a second, how is somebody taking that plant into their body and it does these things to them? Like what is that? And so then the concept of receptors and realizing, that plants and people are speaking this, biochemical language, the same language, and that they can trade these compounds. And this suddenly blew open for me the idea that if there were these plants like that were so obvious, that would do things like coffee or cannabis or the things that with alkaloids, that maybe there was other things that were more subtle. And so I, started studying herbalism as a teen, got really very interested and very engaged. And actually, that's when I met James Snow. Both of us were, very much in kind of the traditional herbal medicine, not in an academic institution, and but also very interested in the academic pursuit of herbal knowledge. And there's a lot of scholars in herbal medicine. Um, and that knowledge, kind of that information, built and built for me until I've always traveled a lot, and I was in really remote areas of the world.
Mhm.
It was actually a very pivotal moment for me that I was in remote Myanmar, in an area where there was no medical care other than what typically missionaries or maybe like a Doctors Without Borders type of situation would be. And I was a young teen, or I was an older teen, but I would guess I was precocious and young enough to not question my abilities enough. But I had somebody bring me someone who was sick and ask if I was a doctor and if I could help. And I
Mhm.
remember just being like, "Oh no, no, I'm so sorry, I'm not a doctor. I can't help with this." And then, the look of devastation on their face and really thinking about it and thinking, well, I do know how to use herbs. And it's not like I can say go to the hospital. There's no hospital. And so I had the opportunity to use herbal medicine in situations over the next couple of years that were places where people should have been seeking conventional medical care, but it wasn't available. And I saw what was possible. And
Mhm.
so I still, to this day, would recommend that all of those individuals seek conventional medical care
Mhm.
when it's available at all. But I did see that herbal medicine does things. And, and so I came back to the US and got a master's in infectious disease and worked, practicing more. It wasn't always in that order. I actually started at MUIH before then, but for me, I've always just felt like herbal medicine is an essential part of our lives. That this is a multi generational medicine. It's something that we should be integrating from day one, as part of our food, as part of our lifestyle, and to optimize our health. So, and I think I'll add that later in my career, and especially at MUIH, my interest has been in the viability of the herbalist as a career. To that the clinical herbal medicine is an incredibly vital, honorable, dynamic, rewarding career to have. And I want herbalists to be able to jump in and explore that and to be successful in all the ways they want to be successful.
Right. It's great. And even to hear about when you were young and it might get categorized as naive, but it's kind of just proof of how when we don't have resistance, when we don't have any doubt, really doubt beliefs in the body, like what's capable. So, you dove in and look where I got you. We have a wonderful comment here. It's from someone named Bridget. She says, as a hopeful prospective student, this conversation is further reinforcing all of the reasons that I want to pursue a career in clinical herbal medicine. Thank you so much for this. And we're getting a lot of thanks. And Sharon says definitely the oldest form of medicine with no side effects. A lot of people are chiming in and really responding well to this, and kind of this is resonating with so many people. Camille, what's your little bit of your story? I know it's much longer than we can fit into this, but what are some highlights for you?
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. For me, I've always been interested in plants, and I just did not realize there was such a thing as an herbalist for a long time. When I was kind of growing up, the internet was not what it is today, and so you really just knew what you were exposed to, and I was not exposed to any herbalists. So when I was in undergrad, I first learned probably midway through, I learned that there was such a thing as naturopathic school, and I was like, "Ooh, that sounds really cool." And I took all the prerequisites and everything, and then I was looking more into it, and I was like, "Wow, the only classes of this that I'm really interested in are the herbal ones." And then I realized, wow, it's really expensive
Mhm.
and long if I only want these herbal classes. And so I was like, I don't know. I didn't want to kind of do all of that just for my one interest in the herbs. So I kind of set it aside, and then I was traveling across the country via bus, and I saw at a farmer's market there was an herbalist there, and it said "Apprentice Wanted" on her sign in New Mexico, and so I became her apprentice, and that's kind of how I started. That's the first time I knew there was such a thing as an herbalist, and that was Monica Rude in Silver City, New Mexico. And so that kind of got me into this path.
That's fascinating. I think one of my next books should be about your lives because it would definitely be sold into a series. I'm sure I could do that easily. We're getting so many fans chiming in. Carol says it's great seeing Bevan and Camille, excellent professors. James, how did you get started?
Well, I actually came at this through nutrition originally. So I just, as a teenager, I just wanted to connect more with the food that I was eating to understand that better. I became a vegetarian at that time. I'm not a vegetarian currently, but I became a vegetarian. So I just got very interested in the environmental impact of foods, being of agriculture, and just wanted to eat a healthier whole foods diet.
Mm-hmm.
And then also to connect to nature. That was really a driving force to me. I'm not sure that I really understood that at the time, but something didn't feel right for me in my life. And being in nature was one of the things that brought me a sense of peace.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's interesting. You see this research on what's called Shinrin Yoku, or forest bathing, and the idea of how being in nature and the physiological impacts of that and the potential health impacts of that. But so I think I was just drawn to that connection. And then through a number of relatively odd circumstances, I ended up getting hired at an little herb store, and started learning about plants. And the person I worked with took me out on an herb walk, and then I was sold. Like the fact that I could walk out into the woods and find medicines, that just blew my mind as someone who grew up as a kid in the suburbs. And so then I went heavily to herbal medicine, and then many years later, 20, 25 years later, I came back to MUIH actually to take my doctorate in clinical nutrition, because I realized how important the intersection of herbs and nutrition are. And I think herbs are really great for tweaking things and for dealing with more acute situations, and they're wonderful for dealing with chronic health issues as well.
Mhm.
But ultimately, I think it is the foods we eat multiple meals a day, day in, day out, that really help lay our baseline of health. And I really wanted to have a stronger knowledge and understanding of that component. So I think either field alone is wonderful, but both fields together, I think, are probably ideal.
And you've had such a vast and varied career. You have a great deal of experience in a lot of different areas. And I wondered if you could just kind of give us an overview of how things changed. Like, I don't know where you grew up when you were foraging and having all of these wonderful ideas. And then how did you kind of see the world change and the world around these two career paths change since you started?
Well, I'm going to start with herbal medicine because that has been my primary career. So, I started studying herbs in the 80s, and of course, the internet didn't exist. We had a handful of books that we all used,
Mhm.
and they were largely based around traditional use. And there was not a lot of easy to find published research, and certainly not a lot of clinical published research at that time.
Mhm.
So a lot of it was based on traditional use. Which is wonderful and still an area that I have deep respect for and study.
Mhm.
But what's really happened over the last decades is greater access to scientific information for people and a huge explosion of research on plants that is published both on pharmacology as well as clinical. And so we're seeing all these clinical trials and clinical research now. And
Mhm.
sometimes there's a nice fit between that and traditional knowledge, and sometimes there isn't. So there's this tension in the system these days, I would say, between the modern research evidence and traditional knowledge, and everyone trying to sort out how do these two things fit together? What do we do when they contradict each other at times? And so I think that movement towards an evidence-based perspective in herbal medicine, a modern evidence-based perspective, I should say, is one of the key changes that we're seeing in the field. As far as nutrition goes, I would say the big switch that we've seen is this movement towards personalized nutrition, and particularly genetic-based personalized nutrition. And that whole movement about understanding nutrigenomics and nutrigenetics, and how do we potentially work with this relatively new field to understand how to individualize nutrition-based care as opposed to one diet for everybody,
Mhm.
one healthy diet for everybody. So I think those are some of the really big changes that we're seeing.
Sure.
Ultimately, as far as the need goes, I mean, there's an explosion in health concerns. There's an explosion in diet-related health issues in the US and elsewhere. The diet overall, I think we're all aware of some of those challenges. And so I think the need for nutritionists and herbalists to help people navigate this and to navigate the food sources that are out there is really key. So I think there's more and more need because, frankly, I think that for a number of reasons, left to people's own devices, it's very easy to slip into poor food habits. There's
Exactly.
lots of marketing campaigns around this, accessibility issues, and so you've got to work. You got to swim upstream to eat a healthy diet and to integrate herbal medicine in a meaningful way. And so I think there is a role for nutritionists and herbalists in helping the general public navigate those waters.
Those are great points, and especially the latter one is so true. Even in what I do, I've seen how recently I've had to put an explanation to everything. So it was maybe 5 years ago we were just talking about specific foods that were healthful and what to look out for, and now we have to spend just as much time explaining where to get the pure form or the true version or the clean version of those particular foods. And it's for someone who wants to eat healthfully or eat well, it's a lifelong learning continuum because it never ends and the food chain is always changing. So that's absolutely correct and worth saying the way that you described that. Thank you. Bevan, now that I follow you on Instagram, and I know from what you previously said that you're a traveler and that's always been a part of your career, working with different cultures and different places. And I, wanted to just, get your opinion a little bit more about, I know you mentioned sometimes this was the only type of medicine that's available in certain places, but what about the places that you worked with where they do have conventional medicine and herbal medicine and those kind of things, and how are they using both of them at the same time?
Yeah, this is always one of my favorite things about traveling is that different places in the world, herbal medicine is is central. It's just part of life. So just recently, over the winter break, I had the opportunity to be in Java in Indonesia, and there was a lot of things. Herbal medicine is very much part of life, and I think a fun story to illustrate this is I was at the airport, and in the airport there was a convenience store, like a 7-Eleven, Circle K it was, and I went in there to poke around and found this drink that was there that looked really cool. It was like a turmeric thing, and when I say a drink, it wasn't like a Arizona iced tea with added ginseng. It was like just herbs. Like there was nothing that was most supposed to make it taste like juice. It wasn't, it wasn't sweet. It was just this herbal juices and so on. And I looked at it and checked out what it was, and it had botanical names and everything on it. So I bought this, and I sat down over at the gate waiting to board, and a woman looked at me and said, "That's really good for your menstrual cycle," a local woman. And it was so funny because I was just thinking, you know, how many differences there would be from what would happen where I live in Maryland around that. First of all, no one would ever, there wouldn't be a drink that was specifically herbal, and it definitely wouldn't be specifically for menstrual cycles.
Right.
And nor would somebody just comment on that. Because I was first, when she said that, I was thinking, oh, how do you know? What's
Right.
going on here? Um, but it goes to show you the possibilities, and how herbal medicine can be integrated into our lives, how it doesn't have to be separate, how it's part of families and it's part of childhood, and it's part of just maintaining health and well-being, not there to treat disease. That it's not something that, for many people, they don't come to herbal medicine until they don't have any other answers. They find, oh wow, I've been trying everything I can to deal with this health problem, and now I've found herbs. And it's great that people find herbs, but I always wish that they found them at the beginning, that this was before all of that. And so that the herbal medicine was the first thing that they tried in something that was complicated alongside whatever other health tools they have. And I think that this is the way it is in a lot of the world, where herbal medicine is right there from the beginning. It's right there on your table. It's right there in your shops. It's not elitist. It's not expensive. It's not difficult to find, and it's just a normal and central part of life. So I think that's the biggest thing that traveling brings to me when I'm in places. Yeah, I think the other thing I'll add is, as herbalists, and when you train to be an herbalist, you employ your senses so much, and you start to recognize herbs. And it is true that, of course, there's thousands of herbal medicines that I have no idea what they are or how to recognize them or what they are,
Sure.
but I can go to pretty much any herbal medicine market anywhere in the world with any herbalists and identify a large number of what they have sitting there in front of them. So that it is a global language. It's something that we all speak as herbalists, and that to me makes those connections seem really powerful.
It is powerful. And as humans, those are
Right.
things that we can all turn to. So that's wonderful. Thank you for that. So we have about 5 more minutes left. We're getting more great comments. People are thanking us for this. What a wonderful paradigm of healing. It's so inspiring. And in this final 5 minutes, I just wondered if I could kind of get your advice for prospective students from each of you. What would your advice be?
Well,
Well, okay, go ahead. Go, James. Yeah.
I think I would say, follow your passion and also be smart about it. Like, think about a career path. If you're going to come to graduate school, it's expensive. And so, some people can afford that. Some people can afford just to come to graduate school, and it's just for their own learning, and they're going to maybe use it with their family, and they just have that luxury. But for most people, this is an investment in their future and in their careers.
Mhm.
So I would encourage you to think about that, like to plot something that is your passion, but plot a career right from the beginning. What do you want to do with this? How are you going to utilize, how are you going to approach your coursework? How are you going to pick your program? What's the end goal for you here? And you have to have the passion component, but you also got to have that other component. And so that would be my recommendation for folks.
Sure. What about you, Camille?
I think For me, the recommendation I would give people is that even if you haven't been in school for a while, or even if you look at this and some of the chemistry and the biochemistry and the physiology sounds intimidating, or, like you're a dance major or an English major or whatever else,
Mhm.
just to know that we really are making this accessible, and that even if it's been a long time since you've been a learner, or since you've had any, if ever, had some science, I
Mhm.
think you'll find it's really accessible. So please don't let that stop you. That this is not sort of a environment where we're trying to weed people out, and you know the instructors want you to fail or anything like that. People are here to help, and we're all here in service of the clients that we can help. That we want everyone to succeed, and so we're really doing our best to teach you what you're going to need to best serve your clients, and we're here on your side as opposed to trying to work against you
Right.
as faculty. So that's my thing, is that even if you think you can't do it, you can do it if you make the time and you have, like James said, if you have the passion and the interest. You
Mhm.
absolutely can do this. It is feasible.
That's wonderful. And I know also, and I'll ask this question to Bevan, you all have fast track programs where you can get, for example, the doctorate of clinical nutrition and kind of bypass a master's degree. And there are wonderful opportunities for financial aid and things like that. Can you speak a little bit to those?
Uh, well, I can tell you a little bit about, I really can't speak to those. I would talk to admissions, and maybe James can go ahead and take that. But I'll add my 2 cents about if you are thinking about a career like this, and you're thinking about whether this is right for you, building on what James said, this is a serious decision. You have the opportunity to become an expert in this field. Herbal medicine is a fairly small pond of people, and there's a lot of room for experts. And you might think from the outside, oh, if I get a master's degree, I pretty much know everything about herbal medicine, and that is far from reality. In fact, by the time you finish, you'll decide that what you've realized herbal medicine is so much larger. So you focus, you come in with the idea of becoming an expert in something, and you view your education with that lens, and you become an expert in that, and that can be really anything you're passionate about, and that allows us to support you in that endeavor, and to really hone in on those places where you can intersect with a need that's out there in the world. So
Mhm.
I think that's what we create are leaders in the field, and we create people that have that high level of knowledge in something specific. And so if you're dreaming about this, just, think about where you want to go with it.
Right. That's great. And James, would you mind kind of concluding just with a little bit of information about the DCN program and a little bit of time saving and money saving tips?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways that you can approach this. Like many of our programs are stacked. So for example, you can come in and just take one course if you want. If you're not ready to commit to a degree, you
Mhm.
can take. We do provide individual courses for people to take, so you can get a sample and see if you like it. You can also come in and do a post-baccalaureate certificate, which is essentially a certificate that is after a bachelor's degree. It tends to stack towards a master's. So, for example, the first 12 credits of our two herbal medicine master's degrees is a post-baccalaureate certificate in herbal medicine or herbal studies. So you can take just 12 credits and get a nice education and a beginning education, and you can decide, do I want to continue and complete all 30 plus credits for the master's degree, or do I just want to take my certificate and use that knowledge? So there's ways of building this. For the Doctor of Clinical Nutrition program, most students are going to need a master's degree to come into that program. But if you happen to be a registered dietitian, an RD or RDN, that there is an opportunity, there is a pathway to move from a bachelor's degree with an RD, RDN right into the
Mhm.
doctoral degree, the Doctor of Clinical Nutrition. So that is a fast track there.
I was
But
so impressed when I first heard about that. It really, in all of these stackable certificates, it's a great way for people to try it out and to make sure that they have the best program for their life. And as we approach 1 o'clock, I just wanted to thank all of you so much again for taking the time. And for those of you who are watching, please go ahead and check out our site, www.muih.edu. You can check out All of our faculty members, check out the programs, financial aid, admissions deadline, and ask questions that you may have. So thank you all again, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.